Hi everyone and welcome to the first episode of my discography series, where in each episode I will be deep diving into an artist's entire back catalogue. Yeah, this has been done to death on YouTube a whole bunch of times. I'm not seeking to imitate or rival anybody, I'm just having some fun. Simply put, I've been writing about music for my own amusement for the last 10 years or so, and this just seemed like the next logical step, so here we are. Hopefully I'm also, hoping to cover some less known or more commonly covered artists from a variety of genres alongside the more obvious choices. So I'm hoping there is some value to be found in these videos regardless of that. Anyway, without further ado, my name is Sean. Today we are going to be talking about the seminal Mick Harris project, Scorn. Scorn formed in 1991 as a project of Napalm Death drummer Mick Harris, who left the band after they began pursuing a more death metal direction in the early 90s. Harris reunited with fellow Napalm luminary Nick Bullen, who also played with Mick on the seminal Napalm Death album Scum in 1987. Funny enough, the duo as Scorn were also initially joined again by yet another ex-member of Napalm Death, the Godflesh/Final/JK Flesh/Yezza/Curse of the Golden Vampire/Techno Animal/God/Head of David. The list goes on. I'm talking, of course, of Justin K. Broderick. This meant that the classic Napalm Death lineup that recorded the A-side of the legendary Scum album were now reunited, and Uric Records was also on board to release the album. Seems like a pretty good deal. Everything was falling back into place. But what ended up coming out, I don't think anybody at the time quite expected. Wait a second, is that slow industrial metal? I suppose it should be of no surprise in hindsight, what with Justin going on to form Godflesh and another ex-Napalm Death member, Lee Dorian, going on to form Cathedral, the doom metal band. But in a recent Instagram live video by Alpha Muric, he explains that lots of kids were simply absolutely not down with the slower vibes of Scorn's Vae Solis. Vae Solis was the record that introduced me to the Scorn project. It took a few years, but the seed had been planted by Vae Solis, and Scorn quickly became one of my favourite musical ventures, and was a massive influence on my own musical production, not that that matters at this current point. So, the three Napalmers Anonymous had reunited for a downbeat and drab dirge through meaty industrial music. Or at least, that's how it seems when you're listening to the first half, or the first third even, of Vae Solis. Think the punishing works of early Swans, Godflesh, as I've just said, or even less inspired industrial acts like Skin Chamber, in a time before the industrial genre would become a blanket term for lazy crap dance music for goths. The 90s were absolutely not kind to the industrial movement at all, but that's another story for another time. Vae Solis, in the early 90s, I guess, in 1992, with a trademark Broderick wailing guitar, that Nick Bullen drawling vocal, and Mick Harris, well, that guy's just a genius, full stop. As I said, though, the record opens with a spate of industrial metal tracks. The band is tight, and the music is robotic and deathly, lifeless and muddy. But that's not the reason I fell in love with this project. No. Things start to change around Lick Forever Dog, which spreads open, and the tracks become gradually more and more sparse, bizarre, dubby, and experimental as the record goes on. It's almost like two albums stapled together. On Ice, Heavy Blood, and actually, fuck it, the whole ending third of the album is some of my favourite music of all time. As Vae Solis unfolds, that tight industrial metal falls away from the bone, and we're left with the true Scorn, a paranoid, experimental journey through a world of heavy dub, ambient, and oppressive soundscapes. This is what caught my attention, not the industrial metal. And this is the stuff that I absolutely fell in love with. Despite this, I still rank Vae Solis as a whole an industrial album, and it sits there alongside Street Cleaner or even Swans is Filth as an absolutely great entry into the world of slow and horrifying music. Also in 1992, Scorn released the Deliverance EP. I say it like that because it's long as fuck and it's a tough one to get through, I'll be honest with you. I see the Deliverance sessions as one long sprawling track more than individual segments. The way the song titles flow encourages us to deliverance through dub, delivered, to high heaven. At first it seems repetitive and annoying, and yeah, it is repetitive and annoying, but eventually you get used to it. They just break, the constant breaking down the music bit by bit and turning it and folding it back on itself. God, it's like fucking really deep, introspective, murky, horrible fucking dub. There's a few sparks of guitar, some lighter elements, but this is a massive step off the deep end from what the band experimented with on the second half of the Vae Solis album. The Uric CD reissue of this also includes 3 Sabres of Paradise remixes of the track Exodus, which originally appeared on a later Scorn album. This takes the EP length to nearly an hour. The remixes are much more ambient, they're much more uplifting, and they have gazing, like synth work. It's much nicer than the deep, dark mires of Deliverance itself. Colossus is a trip. In only a year since their debut album, this record showcases the sheer progression that Scorn was making as a project. It would perhaps be lazy of me to say that Colossus continues in the vein of the moody, dubby second half of Vae Solis, but truly it is something much more sparse, harrowing and desperate. The songs are lengthy trips, spaced out and stretched. The drums are drenched in reverb. The feeling is dense and paranoid, even though the songs are rather minimal in the grand scheme of things. So what is worth noting, however, is where the future releases would go further into beat work from drum and bass, even hip-hop kind of styles. Colossus stays in rather rigid territory in regards to its percussionist framework, despite the sprawling and experimental nature of the songs in general. There's also a smattering of crushing, noisy ambient passages here that are much like Mick Harris's other project, Lull, but on a bad acid trip. Speaking of acid trips, you could easily compare the music on Colossus to Godflesh on acid. If you've never heard it, then that's a good way of putting it. Colossus is probably one of the most claustrophobic records you could ever hope to hear. It's like having ants crawling on your skin. If anyone knows of any other unsettling listens like this, is there more music like Scorn's Colossus, then please do let me know about it. White Iris is Blind was released as a 10-inch EP in 1993 with the titular single leading it, but Uric released it on CD again then a few years later, combining the White Iris is Blind 10-inch with the contents of the Lick Forever Dog 12-inch single, which isn't really worth mentioning because Lick Forever Dog is on Vae Solis, but the single version did include some absolutely fucking stunning remixes of the tracks On Ice and Heavy Blood. And of course, there are also remixes of White Iris is Blind itself. The band also released Lament in this time, a 7-inch EP consisting only of 2 tracks. The Lament 7-inch is a noisy little badger, let me tell you. A completist item though, most definitely. Lament itself is a disturbing wall of noise recorded live in Italy, and Soleil Noir, probably butchered that, is some sort of live or early version of Black Sun Rising, or one of its seemingly endless Deliverance variants. All in all though, there's nothing new, speaking free, but it is nice to hear these tracks all noisy and grimy in a raw and live environment. Lament is also worth mentioning because it features creepy as fuck artwork by Ruth Collins, who would do the cover art for the next 3 Scorn records on the trot, as well as being the person who did the original Vae Solis cover art, apparently. Speaking of Vae Solis, let's just quickly go back to that. What is that cover art? Does anyone know what that is? It's been bugging me my whole life. Like, I've always wanted to get the vinyl version of it, just so it's more blown up and I can kind of see what it is. Really weird looking art. Anyway, moving on. This is where, if ever, Scorn hit the big. Evanescence is probably the most popular and well-received of the early Scorn records. It features James Plotkin on guitars and was to be the last album that featured Nick Bullen on bass and vocals. So from the opener, you'll notice a few things are different here on Evanescence. Hip-hop or drum and bass style beats are now starting to trickle into the band's full-length records, but be fooled not. Evanescence, of course, is still dark, it's moody, it's a haunt of a record. The lead single, Days Past, is probably as poppy as Scorn would ever get. The tempo is surprisingly quick for a record wallowing in dub, and Automata, however you want to say it, which is just before Days Past in the track list, is probably one of my favourite songs of all time. That beat is so fucking sick, it is ridiculous. Dreamspace is a definitive Scorn track, and closing tracks The End and Slumber are mesmerising, dark and dense, and I feel like I'm repeating myself with these keywords, so I'll just say listen to it. It's probably the record that defines the early Scorn two-piece output, and is definitely one of the easier ones to get into. Like, at this time, things were looking up for Scorn. They had this whole weird ambient kind of Ilbian thing going in 1994, mid-90s. You know, it was really starting to take off. And you think, like, you know, Scorn could easily have kept going in this direction and made it probably a lot more commercial success of things. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on which way you look at it, this is when shit would start to change more substantially. In comes Gyral, or Gyral, however you want to say it. It was Scorn's first studio album without Nick Bullen on bass and vocals. There's no official band statement as to why he left the band, but on the old blog entitled Ask Euric Records founder Digby Pearson revealed that there'd be some sort of nasty incident in which Nick Bullen assaulted somebody in a bar or something like that, and that Harris and Bullen had parted ways after this incident. So I'm unsure how much truth there is to that statement, or how it relates, you know, to the breakup of Scorn, or the severing of Scorn in half. But you can find it online with a bit of digging. You could dig out that article and have a read for yourself. If you're listening to the Scorn records chronologically, it becomes wholly apparent that Nick Bullen is missing. Now, that might sound absolutely daft. Of course it's apparent, but there's, of course, a vocal-shaped hole in the music after a while. And even though Scorn have never been lyrically dense, those washed-out, tired, effect-laden bars were just as much a part of the early works as the big beats and ominous soundscapes. That doesn't necessarily make Gyral boring, however. It just reiterates the change of pace. Scorn has minimalist tracks in the past, but the record as a whole is sparse and really low-key, although perhaps I contradict myself when I say it's not as stripped back as the record which will follow it. But Gyral is still sparkling and alive in its own way, with ticking beats and meandering synth loops and samples. Couple that with the odd, old, vintage-looking artwork, and Gyral seems melancholic, nostalgic almost, as if it's holding a mirror, a fractured mirror, up at the Scorn of the past, where through the cracks in said mirror, the Scorn of the future is beating, literally beating its way through. But before we get to that, it's worth mentioning Ellipsis, the 1995 remix EP album, even, that accompanied Gyral, which sees some of Scorn's peers come into the fold to try their hand at a few tracks. The result's a bit hit and miss, but there are some standout contributions from Coil, Bill Laswell, and Ochur. If you're into vinyl, there's a box set of this available, which looks absolutely glorious. I mean, you could say Scorn's music belongs on vinyl. Vinyl. I don't think that's a stuck-up statement, to be honest with you. Big beats, boys! It's worth noting that this album was the final recording that Mick did with any connection to Uric Records. That is worth noting. The album itself was produced and marketed by Uric Records, whatever the fuck that means, but it was released by Mick's own label, Scorn Recordings. Very imaginative name. Logghi Barogghi, which is an imaginative name, is only the second album after the departure of Nick Bullen, and it still sounds a bit bare and unsteady on its feet, just like its predecessor, Gyral. Although, unlike Gyral, Logghi Barogghi is much more straightforward and was a definite sign of what was to come from Scorn from this point on. Interestingly, though, the title, Logghi Barogghi, came from when Mick Harris overheard an American tourist trying to pronounce the English town of Loughborough, which is just fucking hilarious. From start to finish, Logghi Barogghi is a stripped-back affair of clanking percussion and heavy beats. The moody synths and unusual atmospheres are held right back. Logghi Barogghi is all about the beat. On the first few listens, though, this did take some getting used to, I'll be honest with you. I thought it was like a remix album or some sort of experimental spin-off, but this is a fully canonical Scorn album, despite its very basic approach. So some tracks are just fucking straight-up stompers, heavy programmed percussion looped over and over and over until your brain just cannot take it anymore. Other songs are a bit more laid back, some even barely audible even, with just a purring bass line and a ticking beat, keeping things going. Every now and then, the fatter than your mother bass line comes in, scarily predating all this dubstep stuff by well over a decade, which is just fucking incredible. I will say, though, the basic beats make this record perfect for working or writing to, but it is entirely instrumental. It doesn't ever really kick in. However, for most folk, this Scorn album is definitely going to remain a challenging listen, and sadly will more than likely remain unknown to the festering masses. But despite its awkwardness, Logghi Barogghi is so fucking far ahead of its time. It is literally frightening. And so Mick and Uric Records went their separate ways, with the next Scorn album releasing on Invisible and KK Records, pushing further in the minimalist and ambient direction. Zander is fucking great, to put it simply. It's the little things that count here. Digging deep and paying attention will bring this album to a whole new level. There is a meticulous level of detail beneath the seemingly repetitive bass and beats, variations, fills, and fake-outs. I mean, whatever the technical term is, Zander keeps you thinking, it keeps you on your toes, and it keeps you stimulated. Honestly, it's another brilliant record from a timeless project, and it's up there alongside Aphex Twin or Boards of Canada or any of the stuff that they've offered in their more interesting days. After releasing music relentlessly since the dawn of the 90s, there was almost a 3-year gap between full-length albums at this point. But electronic music enthusiasts did not have to wait for too long. For the year 2000, Mick returned with the absolute stonker that is Greetings from Birmingham. man, like, it's just so fucking class. Greetings from Birmingham, and following that, Governor, Plan B, blah, blah, blah. We'll get to all those. Everything leading up to Stealth, which we will soon touch on. It's a fucking incredible time for Scorn. These beats, that bass, it's enough to make you lose your fucking mind. It's so simple, it's so genius, and it's perfect. The brooding may be dialed back a bit, but that bass, that fat, greasy, wobbly stonk is dialed right up. Fantastic stuff. And in the same year, Scorn released the Imaginaria Award EP. Like an upbeat, punch-packing version of Greetings from Birmingham. A perfect sister release. Some of the beats are surprisingly quick, which is a rarity for Scorn, being the associated EP for the Greetings of Birmingham era. Although, Imaginaria Award has fucking massive wobbity bass wobbles and stonking beats. It is almost derivative for me to describe a Scorn EP in such a way again, but it is what it is. Big beats, boy, get high all the time. A similar pattern would follow with the next release, with the Plan B album being followed by the Governor EP. So Plan B sounds a bit like this. And as I'm sure you can hear, big beats, bigger, dirtier bass was again the order of the day. In such terms, Plan B does absolutely not fuck around. Whatever Plan A was, I'm simply not interested, my friend. This will do very nicely indeed. Words can only do later Scorn releases so much justice, which is a bit of a pain in the ass because it's kind of what I'm supposed to be doing in this video. But for something that is so less is more when it comes to beats and bass, it is a project that really stands unique, even if it has morphed into something in various different forms over the years. But before I lose my thread, which is easy for me, here's Governor, which sounds a bit like this. Yeah. Bass commences. Governor, whilst probably not my favourite, it's definitely my most played Scorn release. I had it on my iPod when I was back working kitchens. I would often fart this out through the horrible aux connection, which we had to a stereo kept on top of the microwave. It was such a little head nodder of an EP. It was released on Germany's Hyman label in 2002, and it's worth the price of admission alone for opening track Headrake and the version of Boss that is on you. It's just 10 out of 10 from me. So Mike switched it up a bit on the next record. It's kind of what Scorn does. I toyed with whether or not I should be including this, as it doesn't strictly contain all new material. List of Takers is a strange one in that it presents a bunch of Scorn tracks as one new 1 hour and 10 minute mix. It's literally just one track for 70 minutes, unfolding as if it was a live set. It melds these parts all together into one big flowing alternative experimental dub session. It's an interesting variation and an interesting choice to release as a full-length album, especially as it was genuinely originally broadcast by the Break FM radio station. But it seems to be canonical, seems to be part of the discography, so it's here. It's great to chuck this on and leave it play through, though. It's a perfect soundtrack for working from home, as I found during these COVID-19 times. It's hard to get a hold of, though. For instance, it's fractured into several parts on YouTube if you go to YouTube to get music that you can't get hold of easily. So I guess you have to hunt down a copy of the original CD if you really want to experience List of Takers as it was originally intended to be heard. But before we move on to the next Scorn album in the discography series, it's probably a good point to quickly mention Anamnesis, Mary Chrysler, released in 1999. This compilation is probably the only serious Scorn misstep in my eyes. And Anamnesis is a rarities collection, a bizarre cross-section of sounds that Scorn had made up until the late 90s, encompassing the early Nick Bullen material, the loud beat work of the Logghi Barogghi era, and then the minimalist, bass-heavy electronic beats and stuff like that, which would come later on. If there's anything positive I can say about this CD, then it's that it shows just how fast Scorn's sound was changing throughout the mid-90s. But as a record, it's a bit of a mess, to be honest with you. That being said, there are some quality beats and vibes here, especially the more chilled out stuff. But when lined up back to back with the older stuff, you kind of realise how much of a snoozer Nick Bullen is with his vocals. I mean, this is coming from someone who loves Vae Solis, and that kind of works in the music that it's in. But when you stack it back to back with the other stuff, it really doesn't really work that well. The track here from that era, It just sounds like Godflesh withering in the final stages of a long battle with AIDS. Yeesh. Oh boy, here we go. So Stealth is an absolute head pounder of a record. I feel like I've said this 1,000 times in this video alone. I feel like I'm going over the same ground, but Stealth is probably one of my favourite Scorn records. This is a record that I recommend to people that are new to Mick's work and who are familiar with the concept of dubstep, or more accurately, his influence on what would become dubstep. Stealth is very similar to the album that followed it, but unlike that album and its eventual exploration of more multi-dimensional sounds by using real drumming, again, Stealth sticks to the straight and narrow, Scorn's bread and butter, if you will, floor-shaking bass, mind-shattering drum programming. That is what Scorn is so fucking good at, and that is what plays on this album. There simply isn't a bad song on this record. Every song is as disgusting and paranoid as the last. For all the slowed down, repetitive as fuck dubstep, accompanied by eerie atmospheres, you really need look no further than Stealth. It'll rip your fucking dick off, pal. But before I get to the next full length, I want to make the point of mentioning both Super Mantis and Gravelbed, 2 EPs or 12-inch singles that were released on Combat Records. They've been released in a confusing array of 12 inches, which are bolstered with a series of remixes from Combat Recordings Alumni. Slightly harder to get your hands on is the 2-track 12-inch release of In the Margins and Pinned Down. However, the next Scorn full length wouldn't come until 2010, and it would change things up once again. As far as dubstep goes, I'm pretty inexperienced, but when the many years previous to Refuse Start Fires saw Scorn spearhead the proto-dubstep movement, some of the tracks on the album itself here sees Mick taking a shot at playing in the genre, truly. Scorn were the inroad into this electronic genre for me, and maybe would have never touched it otherwise, despite the fact that a lot of types of dubstep artists, or as a side note, the subgenre gore-step, mimic the structure and heaviness of metal music. But let's not forget that Korn claimed to have invented the blueprint for what dubstep became. Let's just pretend that didn't happen. Even though I just said, let's not forget. Despite, though, speaking of metal, this double 12-inch by Ohm Resistance does not strike any resemblance to the Psydo dub metal mix that Scorn once shat out many moons ago. I have heard this style of music described as darkstep or dungeon dubstep, and I can see how the slow, clanking, echoic, and vividly dark vibe lends itself excellently to these well-deserved tags, as daft as they may sound, but a lot of Mick Harris's later Scorn stuff can blend together, let's be honest, but Refuse Start Fires stands out from the later offerings by incorporating a real drumming performance alongside the usual ear-piercing sampled snare and bass hits. This adds a strange dynamic to the otherwise rather clinical and menacing Scorn sound that hasn't been seen since the days of Colossus, etc., when Harris performed drums himself. Just a side note here, there's another Mick Harris project called Fret, which is basically this kind of album but on fucking steroids. There's a recent release a few years ago called Overdepth, and it's just absolutely pounding. Like, is it techno? Is it noise? Who knows? It's just like, there's that as well. As a side note, a little bonus inclusion there before we move on to the next Scorn release. Sadly, Yozza, I'm assuming that's how you say Yozza, the album title, or EP title rather, was released in the arse end of 2011 and was until very recently the last thing that Mick Harris would put out under the Scorn moniker after 20 long years of pushing the boundaries of underground electronic music. Looking back now, it's hard to believe how far ahead of the time Scorn was, playing something that was the blueprints for dubstep years before any silly cunt with a fucking Adidas cap decided it should be a genre. So let me just take a moment to champion Mr. Harris for being a true innovator and leader in music, from his involvement in birthing Napalm Death and the grindcore genre, right through to his ambient experimental noise, prolific collaboration efforts with so many different artists, producers, and musicians. This guy has such a prolific output, I cannot even touch it in this video. This is just Scorn, you know. But, you know, as I said, some I can recommend off the top of my head. I just mentioned Threat, which is like Scorn on steroids, as I said. He has collaborations with Geraldo Benocchi. I hope I've said that right. He has his ambient project Lull, the more drum and bass orientated Quiet. Obviously, there's Napalm Death and the earlier Painkiller albums, which are just have to be heard to be believed. Those are collaborations with John Zorn, amongst others. Fucking great. Just listen to this Painkiller track. Anyway, Yozza opens up with what seems like real drumming, a theme explored again on the previous record, Refuse Start Fires, mixing dirty and distorted bass with the usual anxious soundscapes and devastating lows. If I can't be so bold, I will suggest that side B of the record is superior. Opener Shake Hands, which I played just now, is Scorn at his best. And Names Not Down, Not Coming In will warble your intestines to muck in a good way. Cut on a 12-inch record, this song is fat as fuck and the mix is huge. Hello, this is a great EP. It's not the way I imagined Scorn to go out, but it's not my fucking band, so I don't get to make the decision, so I'll just shut up. And that was that, really, until I managed, I managed to catch Scorn, Mick performing as Scorn in 2011's Roadburn Festival. But yeah, that was the project essentially over at that point. Until... And just like that, it's like the last 8 years never happened. Mick Harris low-key returned in 2019 with the Scorn project. Feather brings more of that paranoid soundscape, slow-mo beat work that we all love so much from the later era of the project's output. All in all, it just whet our appetites, though, for what was to quickly follow. I just want to say, as someone who never thought I would hear new Scorn material, with it being one of my favourite low-key projects ever, I absolutely shit the bed when I found out this project had returned last year. It even inspired me to go back and fill the gaps, and finally to complete every single fucking Scorn record and you know, listen to all of them, and then to do my first discography video, which you're now listening to or watching. So to me, Cafe Mor, I'm assuming that's how you say it. It travels in the veins of the material on Gravelbed or the massive Super Mantis. I'll admit, this album doesn't really push the boat forward, which is a little bit disappointing, but instead it wallows in the mire of its own claustrophobic density. But yeah, I don't fucking care about moving forward so much. I'm so happy to be able to lose myself in some new paranoid dark electronic passages and beats. The second from last track contains a bizarre vocal accompaniment from one of the dudes in the really interesting project Sleaford Mods, which is interesting, but otherwise it's par for the course here with banger after banger of wall climbing atmospherics and gut rattling bass. And honestly, really isn't a bad thing. I mean, this is such a good record. Anyways, that abruptly brings my Scorn retrospective to an end. It'll be a massive pain in the dick if he releases another album, but fuck it. This project is one of my all-time favourite musical ventures and something I feel is incredibly important to the underground of UK electronic music. If you like this video, give me a like and all that shit. Subscribe, because I will no doubt be returning to this format in the future. I run my own website where I collect my own thoughts on music, media, and other movies, shit like that. It's a place where I could catalogue all the awesome shit I come across, like a traditional reviews website almost, but it's just a bit more personal. It's called linesinwax.com if you're interested, but it's more just there for me to just reflect on things I've listened to. Some of my friends as well, they will contribute reviews now and then, but you know, just stick here and look at the channel. I may be doing some more discography series in the future, and thank you for watching. So here's to more Scorn material. Cheers, Mick, for all the banging beats. I'll catch you in the next one.